Growing up as a kid, I was a Game Boy obsessed freak. From Pokemon to Mario, I played them all. But there was one glaring omission, and that was The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening and the Oracle games, but I'll talk about those another day, young man. Part of the reason I never played it was because I felt I had to experience A Link to the Past first, and well, I only recently just completed that. But even after that, I still had some doubts about Link's Awakening. Was it really going to live up to a whole-ass SNES game? But then I got my hands on the game, and I was surprised. I feel like a lot of people are really sleeping on this game, thinking it's just a Game Boy game, Switch game. How deep could it go? And I certainly thought that way initially. However, by the end of my journey, I found myself unable to shake this game from my mind, whether it was in black and white in its vibrant color remake or the Switch remake's charming clay art style. And today I wanted to talk to you about it and reach out to all the Link's Awakening fans in the comments, because I know you're out there saying it's better than A Link to the Past in my other Zelda videos. Also, just forewarning for you Switch haters, a lot of the footage here will be primarily from the Switch version, as that's the one I played first, but even then I couldn't get my grubby little Game Boy loving hands off the original before finishing this video, so I did indeed play both. That being said, I think you can change these both pretty faithfully. So with that, enough with the appetizer, and let's slice into this hefty Game Boy meal and talk about this underrated, perfectly rated game. Okay, well, Metacritic does give it an 87, and I think it's at least like a 90 or a 95. Link's Awakening opens with an animated cutscene of our green-hatted hero battling a mighty storm, and after that you wake up on a strange island, with the game intentionally keeping the details vague about how you ended up here. I also find it intriguing that the Game Boy manual kept it relatively vague as well, unlike A Link to the Past manual where it goes into the details and background and the history of this world, but here it makes sense. This game's setup is supposed to be a mystery to you. Regardless, I think the thing most people will notice about this remake is the way that it looks and its fresh, unique art style. Every character in the Switch remake looks like a little clay figurine, even though they made the questionable decision to make Link's hair color blonde instead of pink, which is quite unfortunate. And while the graphics did indeed get better than 1993, performance hasn't, and that's the story of modern gaming if I ever heard one. And while poor performance is a shame, I think the bigger sin becomes more apparent when you make your way towards your first goal of finding your sword on the beach. Because not only is there stuttering, but you're stuck in 8-directional movement, much like the original Game Boy game and A Link to the Past, but in those games I praised it, but here, it just doesn't really look so good. It's pretty jarring at first when you're snapping around in every direction instead of full analog movement, much like in A Link Between Worlds where you do have that full analog movement, and I think it just feels a lot better in that game. However, if you're not someone who's bothered by this at first, it might be fine. Now as you move on and ignore those blemishes, on account of being a Nintendo shill, you'll get access to your sword and finally adding combat to this game, which I feel like I have a lot more to say about. The combat in this game is like 2 steps forward and 1 step back from A Link to the Past, which is a dumb way of saying that they've improved it, but it's still not perfect. If you're familiar with A Link to the Past, it's mostly the same here, including items like the Pegasus boots return, so you can run in a straight line and satisfyingly stab through a bunch of enemies. You also have bombs, boomerangs, magic rods, bows, hook shots. I love the hook shot, and the list goes on. For most of it, it's a pretty standard Zelda experience, but the standout new ability here is Rock's Feather. This is the first power-up item you get in the first dungeon, and this is the item that defines Link's Awakening's movement and separates it from the earlier games. This item gives you the ability to jump, and no longer do you have to find a high ledge in order to perform such a death-defying feat, and you can jump at any time in the game. And I know I had Rock's Feather mapped to the X or Y button for about 80% of the game because of how widely it's used here. Also, I really like how the ability to jump isn't just for show, it's also used when fighting bosses and specific enemies to flip over them and deal a nice sword slash to the ass. Though talking about this does let me reflect on one issue that I think most people would probably agree with. This remake is not really the hardest game of all time, which is fine, but I think that's only because the original only allowed you to map things to 2 buttons for everything, not because they have intentionally downgraded this Switch experience. Items like the shield have been fully mapped to the R trigger, and this allows you to block, which is very innovative for the time, but also kind of lets you riposte the enemies when they stab at you and they stumble back, leaving them open for a nice cool sword attack. And this is pretty cool, but it makes the action much easier than the original where you had to pull up a menu and map the shield to A or B every single time you wanted to use the shield. And your sword attack is always linked to your A button, your sprint is always linked to the L button after you get the boots, and again, this is nice, but it just really makes this game feel very easy. I almost liken the experience a lot to playing a fighting game with a 3-button controller versus a 6-button controller. It's definitely not game-breaking, but it does cause this remake to be much easier with all those extra buttons, and this is great for quality of life. However, playing a good amount of the OG, it's just much more heart-thumping when you only have 2 options. It plays out very similar in a way to like a survival horror game with such limited inventory, and when you're on edge a bit more, it does make the experience just a little bit more memorable. I think both are still valid. It's not like I didn't find challenge here, but for most of the experience, the challenge laid with the dungeon puzzles, racking my brain, and that difficulty just doesn't quite line up with the combat in the remake, causing me to just yawn a little bit at a couple times. And it's just kind of weird for you to go through a hard as balls dungeon only for the boss to be dispatched in under a minute and in one try. But enough about the combat, let's talk a little bit more about the story and the wonderful overworld. Now I am combining these two because I think in Link's Awakening they are just so intertwined. This game takes place on Koholint Island, where there's more named characters than any other Zelda game up until this point. Your goal is simple: defeat a bunch of dungeon bosses who hate the sound of music, collect their instruments, and wake up the windfish, which does look a little bit more like a whale to me, not a fish, but I'm not sure where they were going with that. This game is the beginning of all the weird and wacky characters with side quests, which was a huge surprise for me because I originally thought that was a Ocarina of Time invention. Games like A Link to the Past definitely had some good moments and fun little stories, but here the characters are just on a whole nother level. One of the things I'll miss the most about this game is just chatting up these bizarre islanders, and this is a game that wants you to immerse yourself with the characters and interact with their stories and just kind of get to know them, which reminds me a lot of a game like Animal Crossing. And when you do talk to these characters a little bit more, you're usually fabulously rewarded with some good game progression or just interesting character development. One of the first quests that you do is to save a woman's pet, Chain Chomp, and once you do that, you can walk the Chain Chomp around to help clear paths to move on to the next dungeon, and who just doesn't like walking around a good boy? But that leads into also this game's weirdest new feature, and that is this game has a game-long trading sequence that is required to make sure you interact with all these characters and get to know them. And sure, I'm not usually a fan of these whole bring this or take this thing kind of thing to Bob or whatever and stuff in most games, but when the characters are so fun, I can't really complain. When they make you feel at home on this island, it's just so much easier to get immersed in their conversations. It's also really hard to see them go at the very end. Characters like Marrin are just so cute and definitely have a leg up over Zelda in A Link to the Past here, with our little dream girlfriend. It has a lot of touching moments and cutscenes. And it's especially fun. We can just take a little walk around the overworld with her and watch her dominate the crane game, and then lead her eventually to the giant walrus in the game who has a real thing for her, which is it's a little strange. But yeah, overall, I'm gonna miss a lot of these little guys. But back to the overworld, there is a portal system here, which you get pretty early on, that you can just jump around that map, but I found that I wasn't really using that quite so much. This overworld is extremely dense and packed with secrets and puzzles, and I didn't want to miss a single thing, so I pretty much walked and sprinted around for most of the time, especially when you can vibe out to this amazing music. This game's overworld is not really like Hyrule and A Link to the Past. Dare I say this game's overworld is much more ambitious. I liked A Link to the Past overworld for its simplicity and the surprise of the dark world, and honestly I'd say that makes A Link to the Past a lot more replayable, where here this game is a little bit more of a one-time experience with this fantastic overworld, and I could probably debate which one I like more or less for the rest of my life, and I don't really have an answer because I feel like these games are just doing different things with their overworld. Now let's talk about another thing I had initially underestimated: the dungeons. I figured that they were probably good, but they'd be much more limited than the ones in A Link to the Past, a whole-ass SNES game, and I was wrong. Now the first couple dungeons were good stuff, but I felt they were more on par with the Link to the Past quality. The dungeons have good pacing and good puzzles and some okay boss fights, but nothing really mind-blowing in the beginning. But then I realized something around Catfish Mall on my quest to get the ever-so-lovable hookshot. Dungeons were getting a lot harder, but in a good way, and I was having a lot more fun. And then by the time I got to Eagle's Tower, dude, I think that Eagle's Tower might be one of my favorite 2D Zelda dungeons that I've played with, but I absolutely love this one. This dungeon definitely racked my old noggin around, and I just love how this one engaged my brain and got me thinking, got me observing, and got me backtracking around the dungeon, but in a good way, trying to maneuver Ganon's left nut around to bring down the house on this dungeon, and all ends up with a 2D, but I've neglected to talk about the fact that there are some sections that are like a 2D Mario type game, and This mostly comes up especially with like the boss fights in this game, which is pretty cool, and this Evil Eagle boss fight was definitely a fun and fresh one in the game. And this is a dungeon that I really feel like I could just come back to and have a good old time in it, and not immediately solve it in like half the time, since I kind of know the gimmick of the dungeon. And then they follow up this behemoth of a dungeon with Turtle Rock. When you first enter Turtle Rock after beating the Turtle Rock into a submission, which again is only amplifies this game's weird nature, you open up that map and just, dude, this is one of the biggest 2D Zelda dungeons I think I have seen so far. This thing is absolutely massive. I knew I was going to be in a gauntlet when I opened up that map, and that's exactly what I got. Now there is a thing such as too much Zelda dungeon, and Turtle Rock definitely teeters on that edge a little bit here, and I think the main reason I say that is because it was so long I had to do this in 2 separate sessions, which is rare for me with a lot of these 2D Zelda dungeon games. It also has a fun little boxer mini-boss fight right before you get the magic rod, and it makes me feel like I'm playing some footsies 2D Zelda Punch-Out game or something. And yeah, I just think the dungeons in this game have a lot of heart. I think they're the thing that really give this title that underestimated title, and I did not expect that from the dungeons in a Game Boy game to go this hard. And the remake is pretty faithful, so the OG really did not have to go this hard on the dungeons. And again, I think my only complaint here about the dungeons is the bosses at the end of each. They're a little easy in the Game Boy game, but they're like very easy in the remake because of what I've talked about before. And it's almost universal that every single dungeon boss was too easy and I could defeat them in one try, and I say it's a remake problem because when I played the OG, I was dying much more frequently to these hunky pixelated freaks. But the final boss was pretty good, and I liked that one and that final challenge in the game. But now I want to go back to the end of the story and my overall thoughts, because what surprised me the most is this is an attempt at a proper sequel to A Link to the Past, not a handheld spin-off or downgrade. Sure, the performance sucks in the remake, and sure, it's a little weird, the focus vision kind of on the overworld kind of looks strange, and sure, when I stare at it objectively, this game should have had full analog movement, not 8-directional movement. But when it comes down to how I actually felt 99% of the time I was playing it, I didn't really notice a lot of these blemishes that much, and I was just very immersed by the characters and the overworld traversal and just the amazing dungeons. And from a story side, not going to go in depth on what I think this game is trying to say. I'm probably still chewing on it and maybe need to replay this a couple more times before I really think about it too much. But essentially, I interpret this as a story about Link and his dreams and how his various adventures have formed his dreams and nightmares, just like our own lives is affected by our own. And using the medium of video games to make that connection through an interactive medium, allowing you to tackle those ideas head on. And it seems like the first time that they really tried to do something like this. Sometimes stories use dreams as a way to understand things, but sometimes they'll also use it as a way to reduce the impact at the very end by just saying it was all a dream. And I didn't really get that here personally. I think this adventure is something that'll live on with this incarnation of Link forever. Or at the very least, this game and its stories and its character is something that will live on with me forever. Also, is this really one of the best Game Boy game stories of all time? And I know I need to play the Oracle games maybe before I say that, but this is definitely some of the deepest storytelling I think I've ever seen in a Game Boy game. Anyways, I had a lot of fun with this game, whether it was the remake or the OG game. It was a lot of fun, and I highly recommend that you just give this game another chance or replay it if you haven't played it in a while, or give the remake a chance if you've only played the OG or the deluxe version. It is definitely worth every single minute that I put into it, and I think this is one of those games that's just going to live on with me forever. Thanks for watching.